Hello, everyone. This is the 199th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I interview Mr. Paul Grech as we discuss his ebook, Master of the Azzurri, The Life of Enzo Bearzot. Mr. Grech is the publisher of Cultured Football. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, good morning. From my end, I think it's good night from yours. Thanks you for inviting me, and please don't call me Mr. Greg because it makes me sound feel very old.
Well, welcome, Paul. Can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
I live in Malta, and Malta was a British colony for a long time, but so the British actually introduced football over here. But traditionally, Maltese people were split into those who support the English side and those who support the Italian side. I happen to fall into the English category, but I've always still been fascinated by Italian football. I speak Italian. I grew up watching Italian TV and especially Italian football because that is mostly the only kind of football that was available for us. So I remember Italy in the golden era of the Serie A in the 1980s, when it was undoubtedly the best league in the world. I remember Arrigo Sacchi's great Milan side, obviously Maradona, but I always sort of went for the different kind of stories. So I used to follow and I still follow to an extent Atalanta. But Atalanta, when they were a yo-yo team between the Serie B and Serie A, and one of the most interesting stories and mostly got me interested in them is that they actually got to the semifinals of the Cup Winners' Cup where they were a Serie B side. They had lost the Coppa Italia final the previous season to Napoli, but since Napoli were champions, they got to go into the Cup Winners' Cup. And to an extent, that tells you how strong Italian football, that a Serie B side could actually make it so far. As I grew older, I was not very good, to put it lightly, at playing football, but my involvement in the game was to writing, and I think I was, and I am a decent writer. So eventually I started writing about the game, but I was always fascinated by these lesser known stories of, well, not lesser known, but maybe lesser appreciated in the details of them. And I always try to tell these kind of stories which maybe do not have this wide reach. And so Berzot, he was, as most people I guess know, was the Italy manager in 1982, but he was much more than that, and his story was quite unique. And I felt that I started writing. I thought it was going to be a short article, but kept on finding stuff, and it eventually came out to around a 10,000 word piece. And I said at the time I was looking at ways to promoting cultured football, which where each week I picked the five best football articles that I come across. And I said, why not make it an ebook, which is gets given out for free to subscribers of Cultured Football. And that's what I did. And that is how the Master of the Azzurri came into being.
So let's discuss Enzo Bearzot's football trajectory. Can you discuss his early beginnings in the game as a player?
So Berzot was a decent defender. He was known for his tight marking, so he was what one would consider to be a traditional Italian defender, so very aggressive, not afraid to put any part of his body on the line to stop the ball and stop the defender. He was one of the things he was most proud of was his crooked nose, which he got from actually it was during training. A fellow teammate tried to score and he put his face in the way and got a broken nose. It had happened a couple of times before. And the third time he said, I'm not going to bother fixing it. This is me. And that I think captures what kind of defender he was. He was not an elite defender in the sense that he was not one of the top defenders of his era. He did play once, I believe, for the Italian national team, so he was good enough to play at least once. He played against Ferenc Puskás. He stopped him from scoring for 80 minutes, but then in the final 10 minutes, the Hungarians scored twice. So from Bearzot's point of view, he had failed because he had not stopped them from scoring, but most of his career was spent in Torino. This was the post-Superca Torino, so it was still very much a club trying to get over the trauma of losing that team. Bearzot became a symbol of that team. He spent some time at Inter, but mostly it was with Torino, which is quite ironic given what he later did with Juventus and the national team. And he was very much well respected as being a leader of that Torino side and quite a good, both tactical player, but also a good motivator of his fellow teammates, which made his transition to coaching, I would say, less surprising, given those are the typical skills that one would, the basic skills that one needs to actually go into coaching.
Can you describe his transition from playing to managing?
So he did manage a little bit in the Serie C, but very quickly he made the move into the Italian national team setup. He was seen as someone who could help. So the Italian team in the 70s wasn't going, 60s and 70s, it wasn't going to the brightest of patches. So after the highlights of 34 and 38, the team had sort of fallen away a bit. It rediscovered itself a little bit in 1970, but beyond that, it was to an extent struggling a bit. And Berzot was brought in to help in the coaching and in the become part of the coaching setup. The idea was to build the Italian coaching school so that there would be a whole system of coaches within the Italian national team. And Berzot was earmarked as that. Eventually, what the idea, it became reality because after Berzot, it was also someone from the inside of the association, which became a football coach. But initially, there wasn't this expectation that Berzot would take over the national team, or it was everyone was thinking that he was going to be the one who take over. But he convinced enough people within the association that he was a good enough manager, and the fact that he was with Italy in the 1974 World Cup, it convinced people that he might have what it takes to actually go and do the job or the main man.
For 2 years, from 1975 to 1977, he's managing along with Fulvio Bernardini, who was acting as a more of a technical director before Bearzot himself was put solely in charge in the fall of 1977. How was this co-management viewed?
I think people still saw Fulvio Bernardini as being the coach. So in a way, it was quite beneficial for Berzot because he could make his first moves without the pressure of the criticism of the Italian press. So Italy is one of the few places where it has two newspapers which are dedicated purely to sports, and when by sports, it is largely football. So every time the Italian national team doesn't do well, it's a national tragedy, and everyone is looking for someone to blame. And often it was the national coach. Bernardini had tried to co-manage to keep everyone happy, especially the two stars of the Italian team, which was Gianni Rivera and Gigi Riva. And I would say that is the biggest lesson that Berzot took from that time, in the sense that he realized that by trying to keep everyone happy and not sticking to his guns, Bernardine had satisfied no one essentially. So the team still didn't really function as well as it should. And so it wasn't the players who got blamed, it was the manager. And I think from that point on, Berzot decided, listen, if I'm going to be in charge, I'm going to make my own decisions. I will choose who I want. And that played a big, big role in what he did, both in 1978 and in 1982 as the Italian manager.
Was there already some criticism due to his relatively undistinguished playing and managerial career?
So the press never really loved Berzot before he won the World Cup. So that is when the press really started to praise Berzot. He was an unknown. Everyone felt that the Italian national team needed a manager who knew how to manage these big players. The feeling was that Berzot wasn't that manager. To an extent, this meant that every time his team did well, it was the players who were praised. Whenever it started not to falter, it was the manager who got the blame. So, yes, it very much shaped how he was seen by the press. It very much shaped the relationship that the press had with him. And most of those who are seen as the most respected journalists of the time, they never really were too enamored by Berzot. And they felt that there were others who could do the job better.
Bearzot managed to qualify Italy to the 1978 World Cup in a group that included England. Did this, in a way, at least give him some credit and confidence needed to forge ahead?
Confidence-wise, for sure. So Berzot always said that that side was his favorite side, even though it didn't win the World Cup. It played some very good football. To an extent, it dismissed the notion of Italy as being this dour side and Catenaccio focused team. It played a lot of attacking football. It did quite well. It was to an extent unlucky with the form of the World Cup at that time and how people actually advanced from different stages. And certainly it was that World Cup was being held in Argentina, so anyone taking the competition away from the host country was going to have a difficult task. But still, Italy did very well. For sure, it helped convince Berzot even further that his vision for how the team played was a good one. It helped build a good relationship with the players, which would prove to be fundamental. It was praised by the media, but it wasn't really. People said, "Ah, yes, we were wrong by Berzot. He's the right man to do the job." There were still a lot of people who felt that the team could do better with a more known coach, with someone who had the experience of leading one of the big Italian sides. So again, his role was highlighted in that World Cup more in hindsight after 1982 rather than at the time.
Now, what were his general tactics throughout his managerial career?
In a way, he was very much a product of the kind of player that he was. So he focused a lot on defense. He liked his fullbacks to be very mobile, but at the same time focused on the defensive side and then use the counter to maximum effect. I think where Berzot really shines isn't only in the tactics, but in the way that he managed the side. First of all, one of his biggest things was he used to call up a lot of players from one team, which was Juventus. In hindsight, you can say it was a masterstroke because it meant that these players they already knew how to play well together. There was already this kind of knowledge of where people went, how they acted on the pitch, which is very hard to develop when you're a a national team manager. You have only a few weeks with the players every year, so it's very hard to build those patterns. And Berzot always loved to have those same players that knew how to play with each other. And also, he built a very strong rapport with his players. He got to know them very well. He was a great shield to them. They always knew that they had his support. So I would say what his biggest insight, it wasn't necessarily in how his team played. It was a very Italian way of playing, to put sort of to use a cliche. But what he did was build a very good relationship with his players. He was sort of Jose Mourinho before Jose Mourinho, to put it in. He was not maybe this character who had the flamboyance with the media, but his players knew that they had his support. They knew that he trusted how they played, and didn't want them to change a lot of things from what they were used to playing, and he gave them a lot of confidence. So his main focus wasn't defending himself, but defending his players, and that ultimately was one of the key things for Italy at that World Cup.
Yeah, and in the simplest terms, would his tactics most likely be zona mista?
Yes, so it was man marking, but then the midfielders were expected to track back, to track certain players, to hold certain areas. So that is what his overall view of the game was at the time.
And you already mentioned that he selected many players from Juventus. In fact, for this 1978 cycle, he managed Italy at a time when Juventus and Torino were the dominant teams of the day. And naturally, he selected those players in block. Was this a source of press criticism until the end of his management days?
Very much so. Well, not exactly till the end of his managerial days, but certainly pre 1982. So what Bearzot did was, as I said, select players from which he felt were willing to, first of all, they knew how to play with each other. And secondly, were willing to sacrifice themselves for the team. If he thought that a player was more of a individualist, he was a little bit shunned by, I would say, by Berzot. And he wanted to avoid what his predecessor had to face, where he took someone with him, which was from maybe from a considered a bigger talent by the press, and then be pressured into playing him. So he often made the decision, let me not take these other players from Torino, from Inter, from Roma, who were seen, who were championed by the local press, and then be pressured into using them. What you have to consider also is that in Italy there are sort of three main publishing areas. There is Turin, there is Milan, and there is Rome. And obviously every sort of area champions its own players. So when he did not play, get Beccalossi, who was an Inter striker with the national team, the Milan-based press used to hammer Berzot for that, and the criticism was constant on for him not picking. It was the same with Roma and to an extent Torino. And actually, it was ironic that he was a previous Torino player, but he championed a lot their big rivals Juventus. And obviously, so people used to pick on these players which were not being used. They were used to point their fingers again at Berzot because they said this was an example of him not being able to manage these big players, which is why he did not choose them. But in truth, everyone wanted to see the. So Berzot's main aim was that Italy won. Whereas I'm not doubting that any of these regional-based newspapers were not patriotic, but they would have preferred, if they were, for example, Milan-based, they would have preferred Italy to win with Inter players. It was the same in Rome. So if the team lost, especially, it was easy for them to say, ah, it's losing because he did not pick this Inter player, this Roma player. So it became a huge point of contention with Berzot, and one of the reasons that his preparation, his lead up to the 1982 World Cup was so fraught with controversy with the media.
There's a story that before Italy's match against Belgium in January 1977, Italy were playing in Roma, and there was pressure from authorities to include a Roma or a Lazio player in the lineup to attract the Roman crowd. But Bearzot replied that, quote, I'm paid to look after the football team, not the bank account.
And that I think very much explained what kind of man he was. He was a very principled man. His job was for his team to win and not to do the PR stuff or to do what looked good. And if you sort of take moments of his career, it was always this way. So before I spoke about his broken nose, it did not bother him that his nose looked crooked. Actually, it was a point of pride for him that it showed that he was willing to give everything for his job. And it is also what he took with him in the national team. I want my team to win, not to play the political game within the association to help this person or that club or boost the financial situation of a club by playing its player in the national team so that it can sell for more and play all of this political game. He wanted a team which knew how to play his way, and that was all that mattered to him.
And you mentioned the brilliant performance in the 1978 World Cup where Italy finished fourth. And what's also significant about that World Cup is that he gambled on youngsters like Antonio Cabrini and Paolo Rossi, who did not have many caps beforehand. He also did have a good instinct on young players and did not shy away from throwing them in the deep end if he felt they could perform.
What you have to also consider is that Berzot, as we said earlier, he had been in the Italian national system before, so he knew all the young players that coming through. He had coached the Olympic side and the under 21, so he knew which players were coming through. He knew their characters and he knew who he could count on. His playing of Cabrini and Paolo Rossi in that World Cup, it was to an extent playing those players who knew who had his capabilities, but he who knew he could depend on them. He made a gamble, it turned out well, and those two were actually two key players then in the 1982 World Cup, in the sense that they became very much Berzot's biggest defenders, even till the end of their playing career. And afterwards, they kept saying what a brilliant motivator he was. So, to an extent, they were his players because he had given them the chance. He had trusted them when others did it. And this is the side of Berzot that people perhaps did not appreciate enough. This ability to build a team. And I would say for a national coach, this is the hardest thing to do. Building this cohesive system where players who maybe do not play with each other every week or who do not play in that manager systems every week can come in and use their talent in a way that fits with what that manager wants. And if I were to say, before you ask me his tactics, what his biggest thing was to get the national team to play like a club side in the sense that it knew what the manager wanted, which is why he always tried as much as possible not to change the squad or at least the starting 11. And in Rossi and Cabin had two who had played with him for a number of years and who could be sort of his ambassadors on the pitch and who knew how every movement he wanted them, what he wanted expected from every side of their game.
He was unable to build up on the success of 1978 for the 1980 Europeo at home, as the Totonero scandal robbed him of Paolo Rossi and also others like Bruno Giordano. Were the knives out for him again after this?
The knives were out for Berzot up till the final when he won the World Cup to an extent. What I would say, however, is that, as you mentioned, 1980 was in the midst of the Totonero scandal, and to an extent, it was the worst possible time for Italy to host an international tournament because the country was, to a large extent, falling out of love of the game. There was the fear of hooliganism, the realized fear of hooliganism. There was a lot of fighting in that European Championship. There was actually quite a few stadia and few games which were not packed stadia, let's put it this way. So in 1980, people almost didn't want to think about football. There was fighting internally within the Italian game. Milan were about to be relegated, so there were a lot of people who had fallen out of love with the game. It was a disappointment that Italy didn't win, but to an extent, people didn't really care that much about the game in general. So Berzot obviously was criticized because every national team which is hosting a tournament is expected to do well, but it wasn't that people increased the calls for his dismissal. It was sort of more of the same as before.
Italy qualified for the 1982 World Cup by the virtue of an excellent start in their group. However, They lost form from the year 1981 and they ended the campaign in poor form despite qualifying and were even worse in the friendlies in the lead up to the World Cup. Not to mention the incident between Bearzot and a fan. So, was he under the greatest pressure of his career at this point?
To explain the incident with the fan, he was coming out of a hotel. There was a group of fans, including one female fan who was very much a Beccalossi fan, the Italian Inter striker. What happened is that she said that she called him, she said, mentioned some names, so stupid and Simeone, which means sort of apish, and he flipped and he sort of he gave her a smack for talking to him like that, which shows how much pressure he was. So he was not really a man to hit out like that, or he very much kept his emotions in check. So the fact that he reacted in that way, it shows how much pressure he was under. Eventually, the issue was smoothed over. The defense said it wasn't, those words were insults, weren't directed at Berzot, but at someone who was pushing her. It all was smoothed over. But the performances of Italy before the 1982 were very bad, so much that one Italy association member said, if this is how we're going to plan, it's better that we do not unpack our bags because we'll be back home very soon. So expectation was at a very, very low point, and no one really expected Italy to do anything in the 1982 tournament, especially given how, as you said, how they had finished their campaign and how they had done in the friendlies.
Do you think he avoided calling up the likes of Evaristo Beccalossi and also like Roberto Pruzzo, in a way, having learned the lesson from Staffetta in 1970?
Without a doubt. So if he felt a player could help his side, he would have called him. There's no doubt. So as I said before, his aim was for the team to win. If he thought a player was too individualistic and did not put the collective above of his own pride or his own ego, then he simply would not call him up. And that is was how he saw Beccalossi, that is how he saw others, and he simply ignored what everyone else was telling him to do and did what he felt was the best job, which in this case was calling those players who felt even though they were going to be reserves, were going to support his side. What he was afraid also with these kind of players was that if he took a Bacalossi with him and kept him in on the bench or in the stands. Remember at the time it was I think two subs every game, so it's not like today that he could take a player and then put him on and so on. He would have to actually spend the tournament not playing most of the time. If he felt that this player was going to mope around and be disgruntled by not playing, he knew that it would have a negative effect on the rest of the team, and he simply did not want that. So it was not worth the hassle of calling up a player simply to avoid some criticism from the media or to make from some people happy. He called those players who he knew were not going to cause any problems for the team and for the morale of the team.
And also, there's a story that when he called up Franco Selvaggi for the 1982 World Cup, he explicitly told him that he was not going to play. And maybe also, he also took a youngster like Daniel Massaro, maybe in the same vein as well.
To an extent, Berzot has this image of a manager who always stuck with older players, which is not necessarily the case. As you mentioned before, he took Cabrini and Rossit with him in 1978. In 1982, he took Massaro, he took Beppe Bergomi, who at the time was, I think, 18, who was
18.
still very much a young player. And so he did use a lot of his younger players. This story with Salvage is quite funny actually. He told him, listen, the most important thing you can bring with you is your swimming trunks because you'll spend more time in the pool than you'll spend any time playing. Selvaggi was quite happy with that because, no, no, I wouldn't say quite happy, but at least he could say that he was a World Cup winner, which is, when you look at his career, it was by far the highest point that he achieved.
Now, we all know what happens in 1982. Paolo Rossi is back after a suspension. After a poor first round, the players decided on Silencio Stampa and boycott the press. And of course, we know how Paolo Rossi comes to life in the second round. There's a classic Brazil Italy match, and Italy eventually win the World Cup. So, was Bearzot vindicated for all his decisions?
Without a doubt. So the Silenzio Stampa is now sort of mythologized in Italian football. What actually happened is that there was some, the criticism was harsh, but the players were used to that criticism because they were used to the Italian press. But they felt that things had gone overboard with some stories about Cabrini and Rossi. They were saying sort of things about their private lives, which really got the players angry. And they did something which was not instigated by Berzot, but which he definitely supported, which is deciding not to talk to the press after the games. One has to consider is that when the Italian team traveled, it was the players and the association and the coaching staff on the front and the press in the back, or vice versa. I don't know. But they were all together. So the press used to sort of go up the plane, ask this player for some quotes of that player or get some insight, listen who's injured, who's feeling a knock, so they could fill their reports. What the players decided was this is not going to happen, and Dinozov was sent during a flight to the back of the plane and told them, listen, I'm going to be the only one who will talk to you. The rest of the players will not talk to you. We think you've gone overboard with your criticism. You've gone into people's personal lives. It's uncalled for. And the reaction from the media was of shock. So journalists were sort of kidding. Is this for one game? Is this because they knew that without that access, they were going to have a hard time to actually do their job and fill the column spaces. So it was quite a shock for the media, and maybe it made them, to an extent, so at least some of them take a softer stance in the hope that this would reverse the Silencio Stampa. What it did for the team is that it brought everyone together. So this is quite a typical trick of football managers. So Sir Alex Ferguson was quite a genius in how he used this us versus everyone else tactic. The same with Jose Mourinho. So they fostered this kind of that we're going to do it because I'm going to defend the player next to me, not and forget and show all those journalists that they're wrong and how we are coming together and how we can really play for each other. And that is what happened with the Silencio Stampa. What also was a good thing is that Paolo Rossi, who had been quite poor in the first games of the tournament, came to life and suddenly started to score the goals and repay the faith that Berzot had been showing in him. And that is the biggest vindication, actually.
In your ebook, you reference how after winning the World Cup, Bearzot took the opportunity to let the media know that he had been hurt by their criticisms. Nevertheless, was he, in a way, just immune to criticism and learned to live with it?
Definitely he wasn't immune. So what happened is that after the World Cup, there was a journalist who went to him to congratulate him. And I would say this was the second time that Berzot actually let his emotions down and told him, you don't know how much you hurt me with your criticism. That incident showed how much he was the whole incident had been affecting him during that tournament and how he said it in that moment. So this was a moment when he had won the World Cup and he was in a jubilant mood. The first thing in his mind was, listen, you don't know how unfair you were and how much you hurt me. I think it shows of a hurt that he had been holding inside. he was not of the generation that felt that it was good to let your emotions show, especially if you were a man. But in that moment, I think he let all the hurt from the previous 8 years and the criticism and the lack of faith that the media had put in him show in that very moment. And even in later years, he did occasionally mention his thoughts about the press. He was never vindictive or pointed fingers or took a sense of I showed them up and I was right and they were wrong. It was more on the human level that I felt, listen, these guys, they weren't actually criticizing my job or my decision making. They were criticizing me as a person who was, his feeling was that they thought he was not good enough as a person to actually do this job intellectually, I would say. And that is what hurt him rather than the criticism of his decisions, because that had been there long enough to understand. But when the criticism got to a personal level, that is when what really hurt him. And that is to an extent why he was so proud of his players that they had decided, listen, these guys are criticizing a teammate, not for what he's doing on the pitch, but for other matters. That is too much, and they acted on it.
Afterwards, the 1984 Euro qualifiers were disastrous, and Italy did not win a match for over a year. But Bearzot still maintained confidence on the same players and avoided any changes. Why did he refuse to make changes even though the team was clearly not functioning results wise?
After 1982, the situation flipped. So before everyone used to criticize him, afterwards, Berzot can't do any wrong. With hindsight, it emboldened Berzot to keep on doing what he did. So rather than reinvigorate the team or to keep on making changes, he kept on doing the same stuff, even when it was not working. And there was less pressure from the outside to criticize because they had been shown up in the past. So people were a bit wary of criticizing. It's very hard to criticize a World Cup winning manager. In hindsight, he should have probably called it quits in 1982. But obviously, he felt that, first of all, that was his job. And this was not a time when one could easily retire of the earnings that he had made. So he needed, to an extent, a job. But secondly, his confidence, which was never really low in his abilities, was boosted by what he had done in the past. And the same fate he had shown in players in 1982. He kept on showing it in 1984 and eventually in 1986. So it was the perfect storm to an extent where lack of criticism, both from the media and the public, because something we have not spoken here about is that it wasn't just the media, but even a lot of fans were skeptical about Berzot's ability to win anything. It changed completely afterwards. Any time someone raised a dissenting voice, people used to say, ah, but remember what he did in 1982. And it was sort of the best argument to shut up people. But in hindsight, he wasn't making the best decisions in 1984 and 1986.
Post 1984 Euros, it seemed like he did start to integrate a few players. However, this 1986 World Cup was the nadir for Italy as an aging and non functioning side bowed out in the second round. Were the experimentations too little too late?
As I said before, Berzot was never really afraid to blood young players. I think in 1986, he made the mistake that he had avoided beforehand. So he let a little bit of uncertainty filter into the camp. So there wasn't this, everyone knew his role within the squad and on the pitch, and he based things on that. He let a little bit of the uncertainty that was there beforehand. I think this is best typified in the goalkeeping, where there was Giovanni Galli and Tancredi, who he never really decided who was going to be the number one. In the end, goalkeeping by the Italy team was quite poor in that World Cup. And that uncertainty showed up in the way that they were playing.
He also took Paolo Rossi and Marco Tardelli, though they never played, and it seemed like it was out of sentiment mostly why he took them.
To an extent, that's understandable. So he took players who had been there and done it. So he wasn't the first manager to do that. Definitely wasn't the last one. Probably what he was banking is that they would have the experience, and maybe there might be key games where the pressures start to tell on the rest of the team, and he might put in an older head to show the rest how it's done and guide them through those difficult moments. It didn't turn out that way. It was perhaps he was being too sentimental. Perhaps he had too much faith in those players' abilities. And certainly Italy didn't get to the stage where they really needed that kind of psychological help because they were quite poor throughout the tournament and very roundly beaten by France. So the decision itself, it's easy to perhaps criticize in hindsight, but if you look at it sort of objectively, the decision does make sense in that he thought these guys have the experience and they can maybe help me out throughout the tournament.
In 1984, there was a famous incident with a young Roberto Mancini. Did that sum up his principled and unyielding approach?
Roberto Mancini was never the player who responded well to authority, especially when he was younger. So his manager at Sampdoria, Vujadim Boskov, knew how to manage him very well. So did the man who came after Boskov, Sven-Goran Eriksson. So he was always a player who, when he was younger, had managers at club level who would allow him these sort of to act out his age, I would say. Bearzot was never that kind of manager. As I said before, if he felt a player was going to focus on his individual side, he was always going to favor the team. And that was the case with Mancini. So Mancini had a run-in with him. It was more that Bearzot was unhappy with some activities that Mancini did and also some of the criticism towards the staff of the national team. And he simply bombed him out of the squad and never used him. And it wasn't until Bearzot left that Mancini got back into the side. But to an extent, I think that Mancini, the player, never really recovered either his love for the national team or there was total faith in him as a player. So this idea that he was too individualistic or too opinionated for the national team, I think it stuck around for a long time. And if we were to look at Mancini, the player on a club level, who was undoubtedly brilliant. If you look at his career statistics as a national team player, they were quite good, but for someone of his talent, you would have expected him to do better. And even when it came to the 1990 World Cup, he was outshone by Baggio, for example.
The incident in question, the national team were touring North America. I think they were in United States, I think in New York City, and I think he had broken curfew at the team hotel, and apparently Bearzot had waited for him all night, waiting for him to get back. And that's when he said, as long as I'm the national team manager, you won't play for Italy. And he did keep his word. Now, kind of circling back to what you said earlier, it seems like you may not be the only one who thinks that he probably should have left in 1982 on top. But of course, it's easy on hindsight to say that.
It's very easy to say in hindsight that he should have left in 1982. But obviously, he felt that to an extent he had a duty to his nation, to his players, to continue managing them and to continue defending them. And possibly that is why he stayed after the tournament. And then sort of even your ego is boosted enough that you say, listen, I won the World Cup. I can do even better. You remember his 78 side had done very well. His 82 side had won the World Cup. So it wasn't just he was looking back at one tournament and being sentimental about that one tournament. He felt that his track record was good enough and that there were enough other circumstances around the side in 1980 to explain the poor performances that he had a good track record to keep on going. Hindsight is very easy to make those kind of calls. What I would say, so just as Berzot learned from Fulvio Bernardini's mistakes before him, other coaches learned from his mistakes. So Franz Beckenbauer won the World Cup in 1990 and retired. Marcello Lippi did the same when he won the World Cup. So there have now been a number of managers who have followed up in that trend of winning the competition and then saying, listen, that's it for me. I'll leave it to someone else.
I seem to remember reading one of Brian Glanville's columns, and he pointed out that Bearzot was successful in detoxifying the Italian players from the pressures of the Italian Serie A calcio. Have you heard similar stories?
First of all, I love that you mentioned Brian Glanville because I think he was the main reason why I went into writing. Just a little anecdote here. So growing up, I used to go and buy World Soccer magazine, and the first thing I would look at was his column. And I used to laugh. I always say that he used to write with an Italian sensibility. So these kind of flowery descriptions of players and of incidents. But he was the guy I wanted to emulate. So I don't think I ever got close to being as good as Glenville, but he was someone who I think I would say has inspired me. That aside, this is where I think the comparison with Mourinho really stands up. So Mourinho soaked the pressure to let his players be at their best. And Berzot, to an extent, did the same by leaving out those individuals who the media were calling for. He helped his team sort of know the message was, listen, I'm here, I'm making the decision, I'm your shield, and doesn't matter what happens at club level, you are with the national team and you are safe here. And that is, I would say, his biggest achievement. So beyond any tactics, beyond any decisions, that way of shield giving the players the utmost faith that the manager was going to back them up. I think that is his biggest best trait, and also the one that helped the players to move out of what was dragging them down in Italian football. Let's not forget, Paolo Rossi had just been suspended for 2 years before Bearzot called him up for the 1982 World Cup. He had only played a few games, a handful of games for Juventus. And I think that was a way of him signaling is, listen, it doesn't matter what's happening in league football. I trust your capabilities. I trust you as a person. You have to go out and show me that you deserve my trust. And when Brian Glanville was talking about this detoxing from the Serie A culture, I think it was in those actions that Berzot was showing this.
Speaking of Brian Glanville again, they also shared a common enemy in Italo Alodi, the director of Coverciano. What can you say about their interactions?
So Alodi is an intriguing figure, let's put it this way. He was the dark prince of Italian football. So Alodi was at Inter in the 60s when they won a lot of competitions. They were undoubtedly a great side, but there were some incidents where he was considered to have, let's say, paid a lot of attention to the referees and to the referees' well-beings. Fulvio Berardini, who was Bearzot's predecessor, said that the only thing that Allode knows how to do is to buy watches because he used to famously gift referees expensive Rolex watches so that essentially to bribe them. From Inter, he moved to Juventus, who also had a lot of claims when he was there that he had tried to bribe referees and There were a lot of incidents there. And then he moved to the national team. Incidentally, there were also some rumors that prior to Berzot, he had tried to bribe some referees. Berzot was never a fan of Al-Lodi, to put it mildly, and it was vice versa. So Al-Lodi often tried to get Berzot out to bring in his own, the people that he wanted. So there was always this enmity between the two of them, especially because Berzot wanted to do things in a certain way, which is a gentleman kind of way, whereas Al-Lodi was more of a win at all costs. It doesn't matter how, all that matters is to win. And this eventually, they weren't compatible, they weren't friends, and eventually, when one looks at history, Berzot is remembered fondly as the man who actually won Italy the World Cup. Allodi is remembered as the man who was in a lot of scandals, bribing scandals. He didn't, his time didn't end up well, and eventually, so history sort of decided who were the winners and the losers from this tussle, and it certainly wasn't Allodi.
And there's another story that, like in early 1979, Enzo Bearzot was supposedly to be awarded the prize of Seminatore d'Oro, the Golden Sower, for the success in the 1978 World Cup. But Italo Alodi was against this because he said Bearzot had not sown the players at the national team level, but he had reaped from the work of others. So he felt that instead he should just be given a golden plaque. To which Bierzo turned down the offer and he said that it was impossible to work with a Brutus at my back.
Even though he wasn't one to talk a lot with the media, he did have an interesting turn of phrase. He knew his culture quite well. He was a very much a jazz lover, jazz music lover, Berzot, and he was very much a principled man. So if he thought that someone was trying to mock his abilities, he wasn't going to take it purely to play the political game. And to an extent, that is what Al-Lodi probably disliked, that there was someone who wasn't willing to play the same game as he was.
I imagine straight after the 1986 World Cup, he would have been unpopular. Did his true impact become more apparent as the years went by, or was he always regarded as a hero of 1982?
No, no, he was always seen as a hero. So there was sadness, I would say, in 1986, not really anger. So sadness that a career like his had come to an end, acceptance that it was time to move on to an extent, but not really the kind of anger that one would imagine there might be. Obviously, Berzot himself was disappointed that it had ended this way. He was the one who actually resigned, but his impact in the game remained also because he was still active in the association circles. He acted as an advisor to the Italian Olympic side, to the under 21 side, and he played quite a crucial role in choosing his successors, which was Azeglio Vicini. So, in truth, what Bearzot really wanted was to be the manager of Italy in 1990. When it became clear that this wasn't going to happen, the next best thing was to make sure that the staff he had been nurturing at Coverciano were given that shot, which is why Vicini was chosen to take the job. Which, like Berzot, Vicini was very much an association man. He had been mentored by Berzot. He had been given a lot of opportunities. He had sat alongside him in the national team coach, had been successful with the under 21s. This was an era where Italy used to regularly dominate at under 21 level. So Vicini was very much the architect of that, was very much a man that Berzot championed. And to consider the attitude towards Berzot after the 86 World Cup, you only have to look at the fact that the association trusted his advice on who to pick as a successor. And there was no, as opposed to when Berzot was appointed, there was no public outcry that no, the association should go for someone else. but it was accepted that this has worked in the past. Vicini has done well at national team level at under 21s. He deserves this job and he can do well.
So he remained at the Federation, and I imagine he would have received offers from clubs, but maybe he may have been burnt out from his national team managerial career to accept anything.
When he resigned, he was 59, so he was not young. And I think, first of all, there were still opportunities for him within the federation. And secondly, he probably did not want to ruin his reputation, the general love for him throughout the nation by going and managing a club side. Or quite simply, he did not want the hassle of day-to-day management. Remember that even though there are moments of huge pressure as a national team side coach, you still have a lot of time between games where the public focus is elsewhere. I think Berzot was conscious of this. I think he wanted to enjoy a little bit more his life and his family. So I don't have any facts whether he was offered jobs. I would imagine that he was, but I would understand why he did not take up any of them. And to be honest, his reputation is all the better for that because he is remembered for that one great success.
In a way, is he one of the rare managers not to have had a significant club level managerial career and success?
It seems that football sometimes moves in cycles. So at the time there was Berzot, then there was Franz Beckenbauer, who, although he was a great player, but I think he only managed the German national side. I don't know whether he took occasionally the Bayern Munich job. There was Vicini. So and then it seemed this homegrown national team manager seemed to die out. Whether other associations follow this model remains to be seen because the game now is if it was the decision to put a manager like Berzot in 1977, who had no managerial experience, was controversial back then. One can only imagine how it would be now, especially with the media, how it is. And we saw a taster of that when Lee Carlson took the job of England manager. It was immediately apparent that the media wanted a bigger name to than him.
I imagine someone like Vittorio Pozzo with his two World Cups remains untouchable. But how would you rate Bearzot in comparison with other Italy managers?
I think his story too is very different to Pozzo. Pozzo was this huge innovator. He was this larger than life figure in that he went around Europe, he learned, but he was also a political animal to an extent in that he even how he got players to play for the national team, he lobbied and he got decisions his way. And although Pozzo was undoubtedly one of the greatest managers of the game because of his contribution to it, his legacy is always a little bit tainted because he was in bed with the fascist regime. So that will always sort of be a negative mark against him. I don't think it's that fair to compare Berzot to Pozzo. The football world was completely different. The Italian national team was in a total different space. I think what Berzot did was he managed to unite both a team and eventually a nation behind his side. He showed some what the importance of some human values like loyalty and faith in people and trust in people. And for that, I wouldn't say he's better or worse than Pozzo, but I would say that he is on par with him in the sense that although he was not the technical innovator, he still did a lot of extraordinary things. And he will always be loved by the Italian people just as Marcello Lippi is. I was going to say just as Mancini is, but I don't know whether that's the case because of how Mancini left the national team. But for sure, people will always love Berzot, they will always love Lippi, and they will always. I'm not sure whether there is love for Pozzo because obviously at the time, but there is always the appreciation that was a giant among coaches of his generation.
In closing, what is the true legacy of Enzo Bearzot in Italian national team and broader Italian culture history?
For me, the biggest thing that he did was showing the need that you have a group of individuals who are working towards this collective ambition and who are willing to sacrifice themselves in favor of this collective ambition. I'm not saying that other national teams they do not do it, but what he really instilled in that side was the need to work together, to have faith in each other in order to succeed and to get the results that you need. And that is his biggest contribution. That is the biggest lesson that he had for other national team coaches. Before you look at the individuals, build this team spirit. And when you look at all the successful sides, national team, they all have talent. You cannot win without talent, but they all have this desire to suffer for the guys playing next to them. And if you're not playing, to do what you can to help those who are actually playing. So I think in Italian culture, he is seen as this huge figure who had this strong personality to act in how he believed things should be done, despite everyone being against them. And that is what people still appreciate most of him, how he was so resilient in the face of all else against him.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information and the link to your ebook and other writings are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Paul, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invite and for allowing me to spend an hour talking about one of my favorite subjects.
Thank you.
Cheers.